leader would include when a politician votes or takes a public position that has a real possibility to lead to electoral defeat. I mean, there's other ways to define it that we could talk about, but that's one way to define it. So outside of the impeachment votes, are there others examples or a best example of Mitt Romney showing moral courage in his political career that you can tell us about or point us to?
Well, this is actually kind of one of the questions that hung over all of the conversations we had over 2 years, because the subtitle of the book is A Reckoning, and that word refers to a few different things. Reckoning over what's happening to the country, his reckoning over what's happened to his party, in which he feels increasingly alienated. But he's also undergoing kind of a personal reckoning over he's looked back over his career and identified moments where he felt that he made compromises or mistakes or did things that he regrets now in service to
certain example of that
expediency. So the very first one that he told me was his first campaign for Senate was in Massachusetts in 1994. He was running against Ted Kennedy. And his consultants basically told him the only way that you can possibly win in Massachusetts is if you're pro-choice, right, on abortion. It's a litmus test for voters here. You have to be pro-choice. And Mitt Romney was opposed to abortion for moral and religious reasons, but he kind of walked me through this very painstaking process of him talking himself into taking a pro-choice position. And he, poured over statements from LDS church leaders and the Book of Mormon, even trying to identify loopholes that would make him feel okay about taking this position that he didn't really believe in. And
give that quote on. There's a specific quote.
So there's one. He found a statement from a church leader who said that abortion was like unto murder, and he kind of thought about it and he said, well, he's not saying it is murder. It's motivated reasoning, right? He was trying his hardest to feel okay about taking this position, and he recognizes now, in a way that he didn't at the time, that he was rationalizing. He was trying to get to the point where he was okay with the positions he was taking. Later in his career, it would happen on the other end of the spectrum, where he kind of took positions that were more right-wing than he really believed to appeal to conservative Republican primary voters in presidential campaigns. But I don't think it's as simple as saying that he discovered his moral courage only in the last few years. I do think it's the Trump years have been where it was kind of he had the most clarity, and because he was no longer trying to become president, and because he was thinking about his legacy instead of short-term political advantage, he was able to do things that, to match your definition, would effectively end his political career.
Well, whether because of his age or experience or whatever, I think he decided ultimately that if he didn't get reelected to the Senate, he was okay with that.
That's right. And also, if he didn't have any friends in the Republican Senate caucus lunches, he could live with that. If the old friends in the conservative media turned on him, he could live with that. I mean, he doesn't like it. That's one thing I think that it has to be clear. It's been kind of a painful few years for him, but he is prioritizing his conscience over his kind of political convenience in a way that he didn't before.
So I'll come back to my question, which I don't think you answered yet, which is there an example of his showing moral courage aside from the impeachment votes that you can point to on this particular issue or statement?
Well, I would say everything in the last 6 years. There have been a lot of examples of moral courage, but there are other moments. So I don't know. So I wouldn't necessarily say this is an example of moral courage, but there were times in his presidential campaign, especially his second one, where he wasn't willing to do everything his consultants told him to do. One of them was, he was told that he should, actually, I'll give you this example. His first presidential campaign, his consultants told him, we're having a really big problem with the Mormon issue, right? The evangelical voters just cannot stomach a Mormon presidential candidate, and they were seeing it in all their polls, all their data. And he had some consultants who told him, it would really help if you just kind of distanced yourself from Mormonism, basically give a speech saying that this is part of my heritage and my
Sort
my
of
family.
John Huntsman Jr. style.
Sure. I mean, like, I'm grateful for my Mormon ancestors, but I don't really personally believe it, or it's not fundamental to my spirituality. And he just flatly refused to do that. He said, like, that was a non-negotiable for him. And instead, he gave a kind of memorable speech in 2008 at the George W. Bush Presidential Library called Faith in America, where he defended the idea that, people of any faith should be able to be president, and the idea of religious pluralism in America, and kind of refused to back down. And it did cost him a lot of votes in places like Iowa and South Carolina.
Talk a little bit about the moral courage or moral, I think you've characterized as Mitt Romney's last temptation, which is the Secretary of State vetting with Donald Trump. First of all, maybe take it a little bit back further and say, a lot of people don't know this, but one of the great things that the book reveals is the evolution of Mitt Romney's relationship with Donald Trump. They were friends.
He liked Donald Trump on like a personal level. He thought he was ridiculous, but entertaining, right? So the first time they met actually was in the 90s. Mitt Romney was invited with some like business associates to Mar-a-Lago, and he had this really surreal weekend there that I write about, where like he talks about how they pulled up to Mar-a-Lago, and all of the like service staff was lined up in white linens, like standing kind of regally, and Donald Trump emerged like he was kind of like a lord in like a British manner, and like nodded to all of them. And it said
we were intending to do that for you here. There were logistics. And
I assume that's for the book. So everybody else, yeah, thank you. And Mitt just, remember thinking, like, where on earth are we? What is going on? But he kind of enjoyed it. He said he didn't really think of Donald Trump as a serious, certainly not a political figure, but even really as a serious businessman. He sort of saw him as like a loudmouth celebrity. But what he said was, I'm not above gawking at celebrities, and, he invited me to his house. I'll go check it out. So for a long time, he kept kind of having these weird run-ins with Trump. He ran into him at a Patriots game at Robert Kraft's box, where Donald Trump was there with his then girlfriend Melania, and sidled up to Mitt's son, who was there with him, and was like, "Hey, you see that girl over there? When I dump her, the phones are going to be ringing off the hook. Everyone's going to want to date her." And so Mitt had this impression of him as just like a kind of like ridiculous but entertaining, brash person, right? And it wasn't until really 2016 when Donald Trump, started bulldozing his way through the Republican primaries that Romney kind of recognized how dangerous he was, because he was now in a context where, he could be the most powerful person in the world. And Romney just kind of couldn't believe it. And that was part of what fueled his very vocal opposition to Trump throughout 2016, was just that his entire context for Donald Trump was as this like crazy person that he sort of knew, right? And now he's a presidential candidate.
So let me push you on that question a little bit while we're on the topic. So he opposes Trump pretty energetically, and in a lot of ways behind the scenes, talking to other Republican elected officials and candidates and so on through the 2016 campaign. Then Trump gets elected, and he's invited to come visit with Trump a couple of times. The second one being the sort of iconic photograph. I want to read your description of it. You say, "The most memorable document of the evening was a photograph snapped by Getty's Drew Angerer of the two men at their table. Trump is smirking impishly at the camera, his face awash in 'Can you believe I got him to do this?' glee. Romney's lips are pursed, his eyebrows raised in forlorn defeat. Adding to the effect, they are both underlit by a soft orange glow that looks as if it is emanating from the bowels of hell." So for a moment, that's good writing. That's very vivid. Let's think as a counterfactual, just for fun. Suppose Mitt Romney had been selected by Donald Trump as Secretary of State, and he would have accepted had Trump offered it to him, I think. How would that have turned out?
Probably pretty badly. I asked him about this, right? Because according to Romney's account, and I think he's right about this because I've done some other reporting, I've talked to other people who are involved, the deal breaker for Trump actually was actively considering making Romney a Secretary of State, but the deal that he offered was, I'll give you this job, but you have to go out and publicly retract everything that you said about me in 2016, right? You have to say that I'm going to be a great president, you were totally wrong about me. And
He'd given a major speech up at another university somewhere up north,
so, yeah,
denouncing Donald Trump
right.
months prior.
Yes, and so he would have to basically fully retract everything he had said in that speech and after. And that was just a bridge too far for Romney. He couldn't do it. And so he didn't get the job. But I asked him, if you had gotten this job, how do you think it would have gone? And he said, I probably would have had to resign within a few months, right? And it was partly because Romney had given Trump all these conditions. He said, this will only work for me if I get to pick all the sub-cabinet positions, I get veto power over the ambassadors, all foreign policy emanates from the State Department, you can't have random other people in charge of foreign policy. And he was like, he basically would have violated all of my conditions in the first month in office, right? I also asked George W. Bush about this because Bush was one of the many people who were telling Mitt Romney, if you get offered this job, you have to take it because we need serious people in this administration.
Hillary Clinton was another.
Hillary Clinton told him the same thing. Almost every former Secretary of State in either party called him and told him, like, you have to take this job if you get offered.
I think Quinn Monson called him.
If I had had the opportunity, I would have.
Would you have told him to take it?
I would have said that, yeah.
So yeah, they all wanted him to take it. I asked George Bush though about it afterward, and he's like, he dodged a bullet. Like, I'm so glad he didn't end up in that administration.
Do you have
Go ahead. Political bids.
So the President Hinckley story is just, this was when Mitt Romney was running the Salt Lake City Olympics, and he took over the job obviously at a moment of crisis, and he is a kind of, in some ways, a little bit of a control freak, and I think it really served him well, but he hyper-focused on every detail, right, to the kind of the design of the cauldron that would have the Olympic flame in it, to the exact choral arrangement of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir's rendition of the national anthem. Like, he really got in the weeds on everything, right? And I think it was like a week or so before the opening ceremonies, President Hinckley and some other church leaders came to receive a tour of the Olympics to see how everything was going, and Mitt Romney was leading them on a tour. And at the end, they got to the elevator, and President Hinckley was getting ready to leave. And I think President Hinckley sort of sensed that Mitt Romney was just extremely stressed and also kind of obsessive about the details. And President Hinckley said, so what would be the perfect weather for the opening ceremony? and Mitt Romney answered without even realizing it was, a joke. He goes, like a crisp, a little cold, light snow, but not too heavy. And President Hinckley leaned in and said, I'll take care of it.
That's excellent.
So, and there are so many great anecdotes like those in the book. On a more sort of sobering and serious note, after having not run for president, I don't know what it's like to lose. It would be within a couple percentage points of winning the presidency, nor do I want to find out. But I imagine, as you describe in the book, it was pretty devastating for Senator Governor Romney. He goes and he receives a blessing from President Packer, Elder Packer, then President Packer.
I think it was President Packer.
Tell us about that, the context and what that blessing was, and how it influenced later some of his political work.
Well, so, it was he and Ann met with President Packer, and they kind of were debriefing on the process of running for president. And it was really difficult for Mitt Romney to lose. And, it's funny, this is one of those moments, there was kind of a difference between his recollection and what I found in his papers and journals. He now looks back on it and says, losing was tough, but I got over it and I took it with a stiff upper lip. Looking at his papers and journals from that time, he was devastated. And
the pictures. If you want to have a fun time Googling, look at some of the pictures right after he lost, him at Costco, gas stations.
Yeah. His hair is mussed, his shirt's wrinkled, he's kind of like, filling up gas and like grimacing at the camera. It was a tough time for him. And it wasn't just that his own ambition had been thwarted. He felt like he had let people down, right? So many people had supported his campaign and, were counting on him to win, and he just felt like he had let them all down. So it was really difficult. He met with President Packer, and at the end of their conversation, he offered to give Mitt a blessing. And he gave this blessing that Mitt recorded later in his journal, and that's what this is based on. But he said, first of all, that in the blessing that the Lord's will had been done with the election result. And then repeatedly throughout the blessing, he said multiple times, this is just the beginning for you. This is just the beginning. And after the blessing ended, President Packer said, I have the distinct impression that you're not done in government and politics. And Anne, who was also struggling with all of it, said, well, you must not know anything about politics. and President Packer said, well, maybe you don't know anything about prophecy. But that idea of this just being the beginning, that there was more for him to do, was kind of ringing in his ears over the next few years. From 2012 to 2016, he considered running for president again himself, ultimately decided not to. And then when he saw Donald Trump start to win primaries, he really felt like he felt this kind of obligation to call out some of the more outrageous behavior and comments that Trump was making, to stand for what he considered were traditional, authentic conservative values in the face of what this new kind of populist revolt. And eventually, I think it's what propelled him into running for Senate. He felt like he still had a job to do, and he really did often throughout his time in the Senate turn back to his faith, turn to prayer, turn to Scripture to guide him through that process.
To let go of. And in particular, maybe there's something that you had to cut that a national audience wouldn't appreciate as much as this audience might appreciate.
That's interesting. So, there are all kinds of things that I found personally interesting throughout the process that didn't really fit in the book. I'll tell you, he would often text me his running commentary on General Conference as he was watching it. Wow! That didn't really seem appropriate for the book, but I enjoyed it.
Tell him, please stop distracting me. I'm trying to concentrate.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm assuming he was a fan of some of the stuff that President Oaks said about the Constitution.
I don't want to out his thoughts, but he's generally a fan of General Conference. I don't think that's controversial to share.
Yeah, that's off the record.
No, and there were a lot. One of the more interesting things was how he thinks about how best to serve the church at this juncture of his life. And I get into it a little bit in the book, but he really cares. His faith is very important to him. I think people probably recognize that. And he cares a lot about the church as an institution, and he wants to help the church succeed and thrive into its third century. But he doesn't always, he's not always sure the best approach. So, for example, I write in the book about how he was approached by a church leader after his 2012 campaign about forming a kind of Latter-day Saint counterpart to the Jewish Anti-Defamation League. And the idea would be to kind of combat prejudice and misinformation and discrimination against Latter-day Saints. And Mitt Romney went and looked into it and considered, he took it seriously because it was a church leader and he wanted to look into it. But he came back and basically said, I don't actually think these are the most important problems the church faces. Outside criticism, outside misinformation, it's not great. And obviously Mitt Romney experienced a lot of it as a presidential candidate. But he said that the biggest challenges facing the church in the 21st century are young people defecting from the church, the church's struggle to address some of its, darker chapters in history, and that basically he wanted his efforts and the church's efforts to be focused on those things. And I thought that was kind of an interesting insight.
Just to follow up on all of this material that you have and all of this time that you spent, you spend a lot of time with him. I assume you appear to actually like him, right? And,
Yeah.
and you share a religious faith with him. You share a lot of things including a BYU alum and other things, right? So can you really be objective about Mitt Romney in writing this book? Are you?
Yeah, you should ask him how he feels about an objective about his life. I mean, look, this is something that I run into with all the magazine profiles I write. I actually think it's important with no matter who I'm profiling, and some of them are very controversial and in some ways kind of detestable figures. I write about politics, so that comes with the job. But I always try to find things I like about my subjects because I think it's important to not go into the process of profiling, or in this case, writing a biography about somebody, ready to just do battle.
I mean, he clearly trusted you.
He did trust me, but the deal we made at the beginning was, I want all the access that I would get for an authorized biography, but it's not going to be authorized in the sense that you have any editorial control over the book. I let him read it before it was published, but he didn't get to make changes, right? He didn't get to say, you need to take this out. What I told him was, I will have a good faith conversation with you if there's anything you think that's kind of off base or out of context. I felt like I would owe that to him, especially because he gave me so much access, but really to anybody I think that I'm writing about, I want to try to understand where they're coming from. I will say some of those conversations after he read the book got pretty contentious. There are things in the book that he just disagrees with. We see things differently. There are, some of because a lot of the book is me trying to understand his perspective on various things in his life, but there are moments where I come in as the narrator and offer my own observations and push back a few times on some of his premises or point out where he's kind of, maybe without realizing it, contradicting himself. And some of those things I think he kind of saw the value in, and some of them he disagreed with, and we had some spirited conversations.
Are we going to see like a rejoinder published from Mitt Romney now about the book?
I actually told him that anytime he wants to have an event with me and just like we can turn the tables and he ask me a bunch of tough questions, I'm willing to. But he got to the point at the end where he was at peace. He was happy with the book. He told me at the beginning that he wanted the book to be something that he could give to his posterity, right? And I think that part of the difficulty he had in reading the first draft was like, it is really hard to look at this kind of mirror image of yourself and see, the flaws, the warts, right? The more complicated chapters. I ultimately think it's a redemptive story, but he hasn't been perfect, and I point that out. As for whether I can be objective, I mean, I don't really believe it's possible when you're writing a biography, or really any kind of journalism, to be perfectly objective. You try to be fair-minded, and you try to understand things from a lot of different viewpoints, but at the end of the day, I had to pick and choose which stories went in the book and which ones didn't, which themes to focus on.
Maybe you're trading off some of that objectivity for the insider knowledge that you have as a person of shared faith and shared background, that you would be able to understand him better.
I think I can understand him better, but I would still say that this book is not, it's not like a ghost-written autobiography. If he was writing it himself, he would have, and he said this, he said, I made peace with this because this isn't my book, it's your book. And I think that he deserves a lot of credit for kind of understanding that.
Well, he told you, I can't really be objective on my life.
That was actually what he told me at the very beginning, that he had decided not to write his own memoir because he couldn't be objective about his own life, which also takes a lot of self-awareness and humility for somebody in his position to realize that.
Two stories, getting back to this thread on, I think for this audience in particular, tell us the President Hinckley Olympics story, and then tell us the story about President Packer and how influential.
Your plan, and after graduation, and I said, well, I'm going to give journalism a try. We're going to go out to New York. I have this internship. We're going to try it for a year or two, and if it doesn't work out, I'll do either law school or business school. And I later found out, many years later, that after that call, my father-in-law hung up and turned to my mother-in-law and said, so which do you think it's going to be, law school or business? But and I think he only recently kind of decided, okay, the writing thing might be working out. Is that a fair characterization? Okay.
BYU has great law schools or business schools if you want to change that.
No, maybe I can meet with some professors while I'm here. I think my advice is just go for it. Like if you have a career dream, and especially one that will take you out of Utah or just out of your comfort zone, it's worth giving it a try. You deserve, you owe it to yourself to try. And like maybe it won't work out or maybe it will, but I think that we as a culture, as Latter-day Saints, sometimes wisely prioritize, kind of small c conservatism in our lifestyle choices, right? Like you should have a steady career that you can provide for, family with. And I think that's true. But I also think that especially when you're young, it's a time to take risks. And, it is possible to actually follow your career dreams and have a family and, be an active member of the church and provide for your children and all of that. And so that would be my advice.
Okay, it's good advice. Let me bridge from that and talk about, you studied at BYU, Romney studied at BYU, and we'll delve into this book. Talk a little bit about, the book has so many juicy anecdotes, political anecdotes, his relationship with a certain former president of the United States. There's so much to cover. But a lot of his foundation for his politics, for his life, happened here, or at least tangentially here on his mission growing up. Talk a little bit about his BYU years and his mission years and how that factored into the book as sort of a foundation for his later political decisions, life decisions. And, frankly, if you two were contemporaries at BYU, would you have hung out?
I'll take that last question first. He probably would not have hung out with me. I think is the reality. No, I mean one of the interesting things I learned from these interviews that I did with him, and we met over 2 years, and he was willing to talk about anything, and so we delved into his early life. And one of the things he told me was that as a young man, in middle school, high school, he didn't really take his faith that seriously. He wasn't like a rebel. He wasn't a hard partier or anything, but he just, he kind of saw his faith as an heirloom passed down from his, forefathers, but not something that was kind of core to his identity. And what's interesting is that he started dating his eventual wife, Anne, in high school, and they were madly in love. And during his senior year, as he was preparing to go to Stanford first, he said, I think I'm going to skip my mission. I'm not going to do the mission thing because I want to marry you as soon as you graduate from high school. She was a couple of years younger than him. And Anne actually sensed that his religion was more important to him than he even realized at that point. And Anne wasn't a member of the church. She was she converted later, but she sensed that he would regret it. And she said, you will regret that for the rest of your life if you don't go. So she kind of pushed him onto a mission, and his mission ended up kind of being the defining experience of his life in a lot of ways. He served in Paris in France. The first area he was assigned to was a communist port city called Le Havre, I think is how you pronounce it. My father-in-law, who served a mission in France, is nodding. And it was just brutal. Like the mission was brutal. The whole experience was brutal. He and the other missionaries would just pick a big concrete tower every day and go to the very top of it and spend the whole day knocking doors. And there was very strong anti-American sentiment in the city because it had been really badly bombed out during World War II. It also, it was a communist city. They did not take kindly to religion. And so these missionaries would literally go months at a time without a single person inviting them in to talk. And Mitt told me that the thing that was so hard about it for him is that he felt like he had this really great life back home, right? He was the son of the governor. He was, a son of a lot of privilege. He was in love with his girlfriend. He had Stanford. And this just felt pointless. He said, we're not accomplishing anything. And the turning point for him came when he got a copy of the autobiography of Parley P. Pratt. It was sent to him by his father, and he started to read it. And one night he came across this story where Parley P. Pratt talks about serving a mission in New York City and having a similar lack of success, and they were really kind of downtrodden and disappointed. And he was praying, and as they were praying, the room filled with light, and they had this vision, and he heard of the Lord tell him that, I've seen your sacrifice and your hard work and your labor, and your sacrifice is accepted. And that was like a light clicking on for Mitt, where he realized that doing something really hard, even when the fruits aren't immediately, visible, is still kind of has its own sanctifying effect. It's worth it for its own sake. And from that point on, it kind of reframed his mission for him, and the difficulties became sort of character building experiences that he cherished. And I think that that theme has ended up kind of running through the rest of his life. BYU, as soon as he got home, he married Anne, and they transferred to BYU. And
English major.
He wanted to be, he was an English major, and actually, I found out, wanted to become an English professor. He wanted to go get a PhD and just spend the rest of his life studying Shakespeare and Steinbeck and Dickens. And his professor said, you're going to be so poor if you do that. You should go to law school or business school.
The professor wasn't wrong.
And he
Listen to your BYU professor.
That's a good life.
He ended up going to Harvard and doing both. He got a JD and